In the first half of this century, behaviorism dominated academic psychology. It was a theory which represents the low point of any attempt to understand the human psyche, because it simply did away with mind altogether. One of the most famous behaviorists, B.F. Skinner, actually said, "The question is not whether machines think, but whether men do." Behaviorism treated humans as mindless automatons whose essential spirit, our hopes, fears, desires and beliefs, were all treated as an irritating irrelevance. It was a psychology of stimulus response, reflex arcs and salivating dogs, which alienated generations of potential psychologists and can only have been attractive to people too out of touch with their own emotions to allow that those emotions might be a vital part of understanding the way we all function as human beings. Then in the 50s and 60s, a revolution began to take place in academic psychology, a revolution essentially linked to the development of the computer. You might think at first that a computer-based model for the human mind is just as reductive as behaviorism, because it also might seem to imply a predetermined set of rules governing the way the mind works, a kind of Windows 95 installed in our heads. But this is very far from the truth about the computational theory of mind, or cognitive science, as it is now called. Cognitive science is revolutionary in relation to behaviorism, and crucially important to us as psychotherapists, because it is a theory about the way the mind deals with information. And information can include anything that goes on in the human mind. Hopes, beliefs, emotions, desires, dreams, fantasies, bodily sensation, perceptions of other people's behavior and of one's own. All these are information, all of equal value in the computational theory of mind, even though some of them may be more difficult to investigate than others. Cognitive science is a description of all the ways in which scientists try to understand the way the mind computes or processes information. I think you can probably immediately see that it must cover many of the areas which we as psychotherapists are exploring clinically. We do aim to be therapeutic with our patients, but we also draw on our clinical work to attempt to gain an ever more accurate understanding of how the human mind works. An understanding based on the remarkable pioneering work of Freud, Jung, Klein, and those who followed them. Insofar as we are trying to gain a better understanding of human mental functioning, psychotherapists are cognitive scientists as well, investigating the way our patients process the information of their dreams, fantasies, and memories. Now, some of you may be becoming uneasy by now, as if it seems as though I am suggesting that we can ultimately reduce the mystery of the human spirit to a series of computations, the processing of packets of information. You may say, what about the numinous or demonic aspects of our experience? Painting, poetry, religion, our dreams or intuitions, the overwhelming experience of passionate love or hate, the tenderness of intimacy, and the symbols which express these emotions. You might say that as therapists, much of our skill lies in being attuned to the transforming symbols which our patients unconsciously communicate to us in the session. As therapists, we cannot be merely scientific, objective observers of our patients' mental processes, but must also allow ourselves to be drawn in and sometimes taken over emotionally. We must be able to feel love and hate, sometimes towards and sometimes with or on behalf of our patients. It is this intuitive response to symbolic communication which plays as important a part in therapy as objective understanding. And I'm going to illustrate this I'm going to give a brief clinical anecdote to illustrate this before I move on. A patient whom I shall call Anna had been telling me over the course of several sessions about her childhood and her relationship with her parents, but in a way which left me feeling puzzled and confused, because she seemed so objective and emotionally detached, even when describing events which sounded very traumatic, such as the time when her father, a wealthy man, took the family up in his private aeroplane with himself at the controls. He deliberately flew the plane in such a terrifying way that my patient's mother became panic-stricken and tried to grab the controls out of his hands, whilst my patient watched completely helpless, with both her parents out of control and all of them in real danger several thousand feet up in the air. However, Anna's account of such events seemed very difficult to respond to, because I always had the strong impression that she was not really interested in finding out what they meant to her, but instead she was always watching my face closely to see what her descriptions meant to me, what effect they had on me. This pattern went on for some time, with her recounting various forms of emotional and physical abuse, but neither of us really knowing what was going on in the session between us. I certainly felt that I did not know what was required of me in response to the material she was giving me. However, one day Anna told me the story of the family's return from holiday, driving across Europe, once again with her father at the controls of the car. On this occasion his omnipotence showed itself in his refusal to stop for rest or refreshment, in spite of the fact that it was very hot. They travelled hour after hour without stopping, and Anna, aged about 7 or 8, found a bottle of wine in the back of the car, which she opened and drank because she was so thirsty. Neither parent stopped her, and she became semi-conscious. Her mother subsequently told her that she was really worried that Anna might die, but still did nothing, perhaps because she was unable to oppose Anna's father. The car finally had to stop in a queue waiting for a toll bridge, and Anna opened the car door and vomited red wine over the road in view of a horrified stranger who seems to have smelt the alcohol and protested strongly to her father. He, even then, lied and said that she had eaten too many cherries. I don't remember the rest of that story, but I did recognise with great clarity at that point that she was telling me that she needed me to be the stranger who could confront the mad omnipotence of her father, just as the other car driver had done. She was also desperately afraid that I would be completely helpless and useless to protect her as her mother had been, that I would not even realise how desperately ill she was, or even worse, that if I did, I might not care, and might even want her to suffer, which is why she had to watch my face so carefully while she told me about her past suffering. This fear of hers, of hidden sadistic feelings in me, as in her mother, emerged in a dream some time later. She dreamt that she was in a large room in a house which seemed pleasant and welcoming, but then a woman came into the room, came over to her, and suddenly stabbed her with a knife, saying, "Let's see how much pain you can bear." Now, it is possibly true that some understanding of attachment theory and patterns of attachment might be helpful at some point in making sense of Anna's account of her past life. But at that moment in the session, what mattered was that I was able to hear her, to allow myself to be put in the role of the stranger who could put into words the truth about her father's abuse of her. And I would argue that scientific understanding has no part to play at moments such as these in psychotherapy. However, I would also argue that the scientific approach is deeply respectful of those areas which fall outside the realm of scientific analysis, such as the area of subjective meaning. Unlike psychodynamic theory, which at times falls into the trap of trying to offer an explanation for all mental phenomena, the discipline which science imposes on itself is that the scientific method is always trying to narrow down its field of investigation, to make each problem it tries to solve into as small and precise a one as possible, in order to exclude all the variables which might confuse the answer. If successful, scientists can produce the evidence with some confidence that the experimental results are relevant to the question being asked. So I think that as psychotherapists we need to be clearer about which areas of our work are outside the realm of scientific understanding, but which we can still relate to intuitively and symbolically, as part of the art of being a therapist, and which areas are problems which need to be investigated with the rigour of scientific skepticism. If we avoid bringing scientific insights to bear on our theories, we become no better than the medieval priests who could not accept that the earth moved round the sun. They were afraid that it would destroy the mystery of God's creation for us to realise that we are just one planet amongst others, but they were wrong to try and hold back the tide of scientific discovery and to try to preserve as a religious mystery what could be understood as a scientific problem. Some of you may have read Richard Dawkins' book Unweaving the Rainbow, in which he argues that scientific understanding of the physics of the rainbow can produce just as much wonder, or as we might say, can be just as numinous as the belief that the rainbow is a symbol of God's covenant with Noah after the flood. Richard Dawkins says, "The feeling," and I quote, "the feeling of awed wonder that science can give us is one of the highest experiences of which the human psyche is capable. It is a deep aesthetic passion to rank with the finest that music and poetry can deliver. It is truly one of the things that makes life worth living, and it does so, if anything, more effectively, if it convinces us that the time we have for living it is finite." Now, I think we run the same risk as those medieval priests if we try to keep to outdated beliefs about the human mind, because we fear that the numinous or spiritual will be destroyed by the scientific advances in understanding the way the mind actually works, the ways in which it processes information. I think that, on the contrary, the more scientifically accurate our models of the mind are, the better therapists we become, because we can be much more relaxed about the fact that there is so much we do not know. The danger of rigid analytic dogmas, like rigid religious dogmas, is that they seem to demand absolute conviction and certainty from their supporters. And a dogmatic therapist who is bent on imposing his or her unproven beliefs on patients, supervisees, and colleagues can be a real danger. Now, it's time to move on to illustrate the general points which I've made by focusing on some specific areas where scientific understanding has advanced enormously, an understanding which, as therapists, we must incorporate into our theories, whether we are Jungians, Kleinians, or Freudians. In fact, I would even suggest that these scientific discoveries may begin to break down these rather outdated divisions between therapeutic schools. We all use the Freudian concept of repression in our clinical work, as well as the theoretical model of dissociation, which was Jung's preferred explanation for the fact that some mental contents are kept separate from others. We also almost universally work with object relations, the idea that we all have internal mental objects which we relate to, an idea which was most clearly expanded originally by Melanie Klein. We learn to be reasonably comfortable as therapists with the experience of shifting between these ways of understanding the clinical material of the therapeutic session, but we certainly need the help of cognitive scientists and developmental psychologists to correct some of our mistaken ideas about how these clinical phenomena, repression, dissociation, etc., arise developmentally. To my mind, the key issue in this respect is the place of instinctual drive theory in our theoretical models. One of the most clear-cut distinctions between Freud and Jung and their early followers was the sharp division over the place of instinctual drive in shaping psychological processes. I think that developmental psychologists such as Daniel Stern have shown fairly conclusively that instinctual drive theory should be discarded as an explanation for human psychological development. And if that is the case, then the bedrock of the distinction between Freudian and Jungian metapsychology has gone. On the basis of his and others' people's empirical research, Stern said, and I quote, "Infants from the beginning mainly experience reality. Their subjective experiences suffer no distortion by virtue of wishes or defenses, but only those made inevitable by perceptual or cognitive immaturity. The capacity for defensive, that is, psychodynamic distortions of reality, is a later developing capacity requiring more cognitive processes than are initially available. Reality experience precedes fantasy distortions in development." And I end the quote. Now, that point about its instinctual drive is a very dense and important one, and I hope actually that it might provide some focus for discussion later. Some of you may not be clear about the exact nature of the instinctual drive theory and what it implies, and why it's so important to investigate its accuracy or otherwise scientifically. So maybe that'll be a point for discussion. Now, I want to now move on to the question of memory, a topic of central importance to the psychotherapeutic endeavour, and one which has shown therapists how vulnerable we are to public censure when our theoretical models for understanding memory processes are shown to be faulty or inadequate by scientific investigation. Now, I'm going to make two statements which illustrate our difficulty. A memory may be true, but may be repressed for long periods of time and then recovered. That's the first statement. The second statement, a memory may be held with great clarity and conviction, but is actually false. True means that the memory actually reflects real events which took place. False means that the events which seem to be remembered did not in reality occur. Now, both those statements are true. A memory may be true but may be repressed for long periods of time and then recovered, and a memory may be held with great clarity and conviction but is actually false. As therapists, we must have a theoretical model of memory which allows for both these possibilities. As John Morton, who chaired the British Psychological Society Working Party on Recovered Memories, has put it, quote, "Sometimes we remember events pretty much as they happened. Sometimes we remember fabrications as if they were reality, and sometimes we do a bit of both. Even when we do recount things as they happened, we are simultaneously likely to be remembering details incorrectly. All memories are a mixture of reproduction and reconstruction." Now, there has been considerable scientific research conducted on the whole area of true and false memory, and I cannot summarize it all here, but simply say that there is evidence that false memories can be constructed quite easily and then held with great conviction, particularly when strengthened by frequent rehearsal. That means, kind of telling yourself about it over and over again. A beautiful example is given by Piaget himself from his own childhood. He says, "One of my first memories would date, if it were true, from my second year. I can still see most clearly the following scene, in which I believed until I was about 15. I was sitting in my pram, which my nurse was pushing in the Champs-Élysées, when a man tried to kidnap me. I was held in by the strap fastened round me, while my nurse bravely tried to stand between me and the thief. She received various scratches, and I can still vaguely see those on her face. When I was about 15, my parent received a letter from my former nurse. She wanted to confess her past faults, and in particular, to return the watch she had been given as a reward. She had made up the whole story. I must therefore have heard as a child the account of this story, which my parents believed, and projected into the past in the form of a visual memory. There has subsequently been considerable experimental evidence for such false remembering. One such study showed that the test subjects could be made to remember that they had been lost in a shopping mall when young. As part of this study, you might think this was a little dubious as a method, but never mind. As part of this study, one 42-year-old subject was falsely convinced by his sister that he had been lost as a small child. She gave a vivid account of the event, and a day later, the test subject was sure that he could remember some of the events she described. Loftus, the experimenter, describes 5 other subjects who were quite easily led to remember events that had never taken place. One might wonder about the relationship between the man and his sister afterwards. However, the same scientist, Loftus, who has conducted a whole range of experiments on the memory process, has also said that she too believes that it is possible to lose contact with memories for a long time. And this is a statement from one of the most authoritative scientists who study memory. And to my mind, this carries rather more weight than the Royal College of Psychiatrists' recent Working Party report, which drew the conclusion that recovery of long-forgotten memories of abuse was most unlikely. Actually, that report was so flawed that the Royal College of Psychiatrists refused to publish it as an official document, and it was published by the authors themselves. This brings me to the next point, which is that if it is possible for false memories to be firmly implanted by suggestion, scientific study has shown that it is also possible for memories to be unavailable to recall for long periods of time and then be recovered. There are both experimental and clinical studies which are relevant to this. Carefully conducted experimental studies have demonstrated a phenomenon called state-dependent retrieval, which essentially means that we are more likely to remember an event which occurred under certain specific conditions if those conditions are reproduced at the time we try to recall the event. Now, to give you a striking example that will immediately make it clear what I mean, in one study, deep-sea divers showed better recall of material they had learned underwater when they were again underwater as opposed to recall when they were on land. And that's state-dependent retrieval. I mean, they had to be in the same place and in the same conditions and probably in the same emotional state in order to remember the material or remember it better. Other studies have shown that although alcohol has a generally adverse effect on memory, experiences which occurred when a person was drunk are more likely to be recalled when that person is drunk again than when they're sober. You can see how complex this is. Changes in mood can contribute to state-dependent retrieval, so that events which occurred in one particular mood or frame of mind are more likely to be recalled when in the same state of mind again. This phenomenon of state-dependent retrieval is clearly highly relevant to the issue of lost then recovered memories. A child who is being sexually abused by a parent experiences intense emotions which I do not need to describe here. The experience is often kept totally secret, usually at the bidding of the abuser, who calls it our secret, and that memory may remain unintegrated into the rest of that child's life as she grows up. She may, if lucky, form satisfactorily emotional and sexual relationships as an adult, and the abuse remains either unavailable to recall, or, if it is remembered, it may be recalled without any re-experiencing of the intense emotional pain felt at the time of the abuse. Certainly, my impression of patients I've worked with who've been sexually abused is that quite often they can remember the actual events, but they have dissociated from the emotion around it and haven't sort of processed the meaning of the experience. Not always, but that's sometimes the case. However, at any time, that person may suddenly find themselves vividly reliving the abuse in the most painful and terrifying way, if something happens to trigger this phenomenon of state-dependent retrieval. I have an example of this with patients who have had this experience as a result of watching the NSPCC advertisements about child abuse, which I think were on about 6-9 months ago. I don't think they've been around since. The advertisements have actually been experienced as abusive themselves, because the words and images, the pictures of bedclothes moving, the words "come and sit over here," have actually triggered an acutely painful reliving of their particular experience of abuse. I'm not sure that the NSPC had thought of this when they made these advertisements, and I don't know how many such complaints they may have had about it. For those of you who didn't see them, they were very situational. Not much was said, but they were the kind of images of what it might have been like for a child, and they seemed to have triggered this state-dependent retrieval phenomenon for at least some of the people I saw. Clinical studies have also demonstrated that memories may be lost and then recovered, although strenuous efforts have been made by some scientists, such as Pope and Hudson, to discount such findings as evidence of repression. One of the most frequently quoted studies is by Williams, who followed up children with documented evidence of childhood sexual abuse, and she followed them up into adult life. She found that adults who had documented experience of childhood abuse, documented in childhood, sometimes do not report these experiences at interview as an adult, even when asked about such events. Sometimes they would report the general experience of maltreatment, but would seem not to remember specific episodes of which there was documentary evidence from childhood notes. Most strikingly of all, 12% of those adults with a clear history of childhood sexual abuse completely denied that they have ever been abused by anyone at any time. Simple forgetting does not seem an adequate explanation for this kind of failure to recall highly significant traumatic experiences. And a more recent multi-centre study of children with documented evidence of abuse has come up with rather similar preliminary findings, namely that a small number of children have no recollection whatever of the abuse which is known to have occurred. That is actually still an unfinished study. So far, I've been talking about remembering specific events from the past, the kind of memory which we are all familiar with, and which is usually called episodic memory by cognitive scientists, because it's about episodes. However, in the guest editorial of a recent edition of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, Peter Fonikes says, "The aims of psychoanalysis have been greatly elaborated over the 100 years since Freud's original model of undoing repression and recovering memory into consciousness. But these advances have not brought with them an updating of the role of memory in the therapeutic process, nor a clear and consistent theory of therapeutic effect. Some still seem to believe that the recovery of memory is part of the therapeutic action of treatment. There is no evidence for this, and in my view, to cling to this idea is damaging to the field." That is written by the professor of psychoanalysis at UCL. I'll repeat it. Some still appear to believe that the recovery of memory is part of the therapeutic action of the treatment. There is no evidence for this, and in my view, to cling to this idea is damaging to the field. So if psychotherapy does not bring about change by the recovery of autobiographical memories, what is the role of memory in therapy? You may be aware that there has been an explosion of scientific research on the nature of memory, research which has demonstrated that there are several different types of memory. and that some forms of memory can operate completely outside conscious awareness, without any psychodynamic process such as repression or splitting being involved. A most striking illustration of this is the phenomenon of blind sight, where damage to the occipital cortex, the part of the brain roughly there, results in the loss of the conscious sense of vision. In other words, the patient apparently can't see. However, Weisskranz, a very well-known cognitive scientist, found that when a light was flashed in the part of the visual field affected by the brain damage, the patient said he could not see anything, but when asked to guess the location of the flash, he could do so quite accurately, more accurately than by chance, as though he were capable of some sort of unconscious perception. So he was accurate. He said he couldn't see it, but he actually guessed where it was very accurately. And this has really puzzled people. So the word unconscious can simply mean that it's outside conscious awareness, rather than that it's dynamically repressed. And as therapists, we do need to have some understanding of this kind of research. Otherwise, we will be looking for psychodynamic explanations for such phenomena where none exist. There is another way in which memories can be unavailable to conscious recall, but still exert an active influence, without that person being aware of any memory. Implicit memory is a form of memory in which past events influence our thoughts, actions, and perceptions, but outside consciousness. This can be like the kind of perceptual priming effect which I've just described, the fact that you can register a piece of information without knowing you have done so. Examples: subliminal messages or advertisements flashed onto a screen so briefly that we're not aware we have seen them, can be shown to influence our judgments and choices. Implicit memory can also involve quite complex knowledge, an unconscious memory, not for specific events, but rather a kind of generalized knowledge about how to do things and what things mean. So implicit memory is a kind of abstract, generalized set of unconscious rules, guidelines, and expectations about how the world works and how one functions in it. Now, again, I'm aware this is quite a complex idea, and those of you who are not familiar with it, implicit memory, for example, would store information that all trees have leaves, branches, a trunk, and roots, so we can recognize a tree. But implicit memory would not store memories of specific trees that we had seen or the occasions on which we had seen them. Does that make it clear? It's patterns. It stores generalized, abstract patterns. Now, you may be wondering, once more, what the relevance of all this to us as therapists. I would suggest that a sound understanding of the concept of implicit memory is vital to our daily clinical work, because I think it forms the basis for most of the unconscious patterns of attitude, behavior, and expectations which our patients bring to their sessions. Out of the experiences of a lifetime, some of which the patient consciously remembers, but many of which he or she does not, a whole set of models of the world are constructed in implicit memory, and these models structure or pattern the way that person relates to any new experience. Now, in other words, implicit memory is the basis for the transference. The point which may already be obvious to you is that implicit memory is an outside-in model for understanding unconscious processes, including the transference, not an inside-out model. Introjection, the taking in of information, is the main mechanism involved in implicit memory. The transference does not arise as an expression of instinctual drives, which somehow spontaneously produce complex mental imagery and fantasy, which is then projected out onto real people. Transference arises out of the internalization of actual people and real events in the world, and gradually produces unconscious patterns of generalized expectation about relationships. The person who understood this most clearly was John Bowlby, whose views were, not surprisingly, anathema to the Kleinians and to many Freudians, because they essentially fundamentally challenged the instinctual drive theory model. The instinctual drive theory model says that you have innate and complex mental imagery from very early in infancy, and that this is projected out and distorts and influences your perception of the real world. The attachment theory model, based on implicit memory, does exactly the opposite. It says that real experiences are internalized, a pattern recognition process goes on, and these patterns are stored in implicit memory. They are diametrically opposed to each other. There is an account of the meeting at which John Bowlby presented the Robertson film, A 2-Year-Old Goes to Hospital, which showed so clearly the distress caused to a young child by a badly managed separation from her parents. Anna Freud accepted the importance of the real trauma of the experience for the child, but the Kleinians in the audience were unimpressed and felt that the girl's distress was caused by her unconscious destructive fantasies towards her pregnant mother's unborn baby, rather than the separation itself. Now, I think that illustrates the point I'm trying to make. Those two views are just poles apart. The concept of implicit memory helps us to understand how internal objects develop, without our needing instinctual drive theory to explain why internal objects can differ so much from the real world. Implicit memory helps us to see how multiple real-life events become aggregated, mixed up together, and that the fears or hopes which a person has at the time can also become incorporated into the memory of events. The end result of this process of internalization of multiple experiences was described by Bowlby as an internal working model. Internal working models can be thought of as internal maps organizing our perception of the world. A securely attached child will have internal working models of other people as reliable and predictable, and will bring this generalized expectation into the transference, whereas an anxiously attached child will have working models of other people as rejecting, dangerous, or otherwise unreliable. Working models are the most obvious clinical examples of implicit memory. They are really forms of unconscious memory of an abstract kind, and demonstrate once again that it is possible for memories to be unconscious without being dynamically repressed. Working model memories can never become a conscious memory of an event. The memories have been turned into an abstract pattern which can be relived. That's the point. You can relive the internal working model experience, for example in the transference, and so can be gradually discovered, worked on, and hopefully modified as they are enacted. The pattern may from time to time be illustrated by specific episodic memories from childhood, but it is not the remembering of these particular events which brings about change in therapy, but the slow modification of the working models through the relationship with the analyst. And this relationship creates its own working models, which are hopefully eventually more positive, and can be gradually integrated with existing working models or exist alongside them as alternatives. And I would just add that this view of unconscious processes of implicit memory and internal working models actually places the transference right back in the centre of analytic work again. I'll just give a couple of clinical examples, because what I've said has been very dense so far, I know, and I'll slow the pace a bit. A patient had given me many descriptions of her parents, both doctors, as people who are unable to live with anxiety, uncertainty or helplessness, and always look for someone to blame. She has many clear memories of occasions when her parents have blamed her or anyone other than themselves when things went wrong. But remembering these examples has not produced any change in the constant, non-specific anxiety which she lives with every day, and which was one of the reasons she came into therapy. However, during the course of the therapy, she has gradually realized how much her anxiety arises because she waits to be blamed, including by me. She is constantly unconsciously expecting someone to say, "It's your fault." Quite a lot of the work in the therapy has involved a gradual recognition that often we are all helpless to prevent or solve problems, that may just be the way life is, and that it is not her task to put things right for her internal parents. The working model in this case seemed to be of a pattern of relationship in which she, the child, was made responsible for allaying parental anxiety and would be blamed if she failed to do so. The pattern gradually emerged in her relationship with me, and it is the working on that which has brought about change rather than the memories of actual childhood events. Another patient has described the fact that her mother had numerous illnesses and sudden unexpected hospital admissions when my patient was a small child, and she remembers these as experiences of abandonment. Her father was emotionally unable and unwilling to provide the secure parenting she needed at these times, but an uncle who lived with them did offer her care and security. However, after a year or so, this uncle started to abuse her sexually when he was looking after her. As an adult, she married a man whose work made it necessary for him to be away from home for periods of days or weeks without any prior warning. And once again, not surprisingly, she felt profoundly abandoned. So much so that she was unable to function independently and would spend days in the house without going out, often curled up on her bed in a depressed state. She then met a man who was caring and protective towards her, helping her to manage practical aspects of her life whilst her husband was away. A sexual relationship developed between them, but this soon became abusive. It seemed to me that unconscious working model memories of abandonment were activated in adult life by her husband's absences, and this led to the recreation of a pattern of relationship with an initially caring man who then became sexually abusive, like her uncle. And this reenactment was based on an unconscious working model of this pattern of relationship. Now, I hope that my survey of some aspects of the scientific investigation of memory can also help us when we turn to the question of the nature of fantasy. Drive theory, which proposes that unconscious fantasy is a direct expression of instinctual drives, is held onto with great passion by many psychoanalysts, partly, I think, because it provides an explanation for the distortions of external reality, which are so evident in our clinical work. We really do need to be able to account for the way in which internal objects are formed, and why internal objects can differ so much from the actual people, usually parents, others, who have played such a central part in the formation of our internal world. Instinctual drives give us an easy answer by proposing that the external reality is relatively unimportant, and that the magical or terrifying, good or bad internal object arises as a direct expression of instinctual drives. In its purest form, it is a totally inside-out model, in that external reality is not considered to play any part in the formation of unconscious fantasy, at least in the earliest stages of development. And I mean, one can find quotes that prove this. Melanie Klein said, "The child anticipates, by reason of his own cannibalistic and sadistic impulses, such punishment as castration, being cut in pieces, eaten up, etc., and lives in perpetual dread of them." Whilst one of her closest supporters, Joan Riviere, spelt it out more clearly than that. Joan Riviere said, "Psychoanalysis is Freud's discovery of what goes on in the imagination. It has no concern with anything else. It is not concerned with the real world." This is the essence of the pure Kleinian position, and I put pure in because I think some Kleinians might be rather upset to be, as they would see it, caricatured like that. But this is the essence of the pure Kleinian position, and is one which has had considerable influence on the London school of Jungian metapsychology. And this does create certain theoretical incompatibilities which, as Jungians, we have not really addressed. Jung himself emphatically rejected instinctual drive theory, arguing that the innate structures of the human mind do not come with pre-packaged mental contents, and are simply predispositions which organise information coming from the environment. I am, of course, referring to Jung's concept of archetypes, and the fact that there are certain similarities between his concept of archetypal polarisation and the good and bad polarisation of the Kleinian model is not enough to overcome the fundamental differences between the two theoretical frameworks. In Klein's model of fantasy, the content of the fantasy arise from within, as though certain images pre-exist, fully formed in the brain, and are waiting to be released by a good feed or an experience of frustration. Jung, on the contrary, understood that mental imagery always has its origin in external experience, which is then internalized and modified by innate or archetypal expectation. So, in contrast to the Kleinian position which I've outlined, I think you will be able to see that cognitive science research really draws us to the conclusion that memory can become fantasy and fantasy can become memory. In a symposium on the subject of recovered memory, Peter Fonagy, who I've quoted already, said, "We are setting up truth against falsehood, history against fantasy, fact against desire. But these pairs of opposites do not exist independently. The dialectic of fact and desire is that fact makes desire, and then desire makes fact, in an interminable sequence of events and thoughts that are repeated throughout life." If, as I am suggesting, we should reject the idea that unconscious fantasy arises directly from instinctual drives, then we need to investigate what alternative explanations for the development of unconscious fantasy are offered by research based on attachment theory and cognitive science. And I think I've already indicated that I think implicit memory can give us new ways of thinking about the nature of fantasy, as well as adding to our understanding of memory itself. Wishes and desires, fears and defences not only influence and distort the way we experience events, but also form part of that experience. When you're intensely emotionally involved in something, you don't just record the events that happen. You store in memory memories of that actual emotional experience itself. And so these emotions themselves become incorporated into the memories of events. Working models, the unconscious patterns of belief and expectation about relationships that are built up, are not only a form of memory, They are also a new way of conceptualizing unconscious fantasy. The child's own emotions and the imaginative narratives he or she constructs to make sense of the world become included in the unconscious working models as they develop. Working models of relationships are internal objects which include all the child's conscious and unconscious imaginative material and his or her sense of identity, as well as storing generalized memories of real experience. Now, I'll try and illustrate that again. A child who is subject to random and unpredictable violence from a parent will feel not only pain and terror, but also a sense of complete helplessness, with no power to influence the parent's behavior or to have any control over the situation. In addition, without any apparent cause for the parent's cruelty, the child has to face the intolerable fact that the parent is at that moment hostile, malevolent, and sadistic towards the child. Now, I think that for any child to feel this is unbearable, and it may be preferable in that situation for the child to construct a belief or fantasy that he or she has done something to cause the parent to behave in this sadistic way. Now, such an imaginative belief would allow the child to retain some sense of cause and effect, some belief that he or she actually does have some control over the situation because he or she did something wrong which provoked this violent response. The belief that the child caused the parent's violence by some bad behavior allows the child to retain the belief that the parent will love him or her again, that it is the bad behavior that is being punished, and not that the parent really hates the child. So you can see that this kind of defensive belief could become part of the unconscious working model of relationships with key attachment figures. And that belief of responsibility may emerge in relationship with adult life, in relationships in adult life, in the form of an unconscious fantasy that he or she is responsible for others' bad behavior and should be punished for it. It might be quite easy for this person to become a battered spouse as a kind of enactment of the unconscious fantasy and/or memory. The internal working model produces a pattern of beliefs and expectations that easily leads to the recreation of the childhood experience. Attachment theory also offers us another way to understand the development of fantasy in the growing child's mind, namely that, I apologise for using long words again, intergenerational transmission of attachment patterns. The research done by Ainsworth, Main, Fonagy and others has demonstrated clearly that the internal working models of the parents powerfully influence the growing child's own internal working models, reflected in the patterns of attachment which the child shows. A mother who has a dismissive rating on the adult attachment interview, a pattern which demonstrates an avoidance of emotionally painful memories about her own life, is most likely to have a child who shows an avoidant pattern of attachment, for example. I don't know how familiar you are with these definitions, these categorizations of attachment patterns, but they are experimentally tested models based on a set interview system with a mother and child, and they've been shown to produce consistent results in terms of attachment patterns which reflect the internal working models of the parent and child. Again, that might provide some scope for discussion. So it does seem that the parents' internal working models are communicated to and internalized by their children, becoming part of that child's internal world. In other words, part of that child's fantasy. Now, I could quote quite a lot of research evidence which demonstrates this kind of intergenerational transmission of attachment patterns, but we'll stick to one example which I think is helpful and striking. In one experiment, the mother's fantasies about their babies soon after birth were investigated by the simple procedure of asking the mothers to rate their firstborn babies as better than average or not better than average at the end of the baby's first month. They just asked them the question, do you think your baby's better than average or not? Or something like that. Babies whose mothers had rated them as not better than average were 3 times more likely to show clinical psychological problems at the age of 4.5 than the babies whose mothers had rated them better than average at 1 month. The predictive power of the mother's initial fantasy about the worth of their infants continued to the age of 10, when the negatively viewed infants still had markedly greater diagnosable mental disorder than the more positively viewed infants. To conclude this discussion of fantasy, I would emphasize once again that we do not need to lose the richness of the internal world of object relationships and unconscious fantasy if we give up the explanation that they derive from instinctual drives. For most of us as psychotherapists, the core of our work, the thing that differentiates our profession from other forms of psychological treatment, is the fact that we explore unconscious fantasy and the internal object world of and with our patients. Attachment theory and cognitive science do not in the least take that richness away from us. On the contrary, they offer us exciting new ways of demonstrating the existence of that internal world through the interpersonal research tools which are being developed. I mean, things like the adult attachment interview and so on. The key difference is that in attachment theory, the internal world is formed by a process of internalization of real experiences, which are then imaginatively reconstructed and endlessly reworked internally, ending up as generalized patterns of belief and expectation about relationships. And I am at present in exploring the possibility that Jung's concept of the complex is very close to that of the internal working model. This may have occurred to some of you already whilst I've been talking. Jung does seem to have recognized that the concept of unconscious patterns which influence without our being aware of them, long before the name of implicit memory had been used to describe this. And in fact, I have written something about this in a paper which is coming out shortly. So let me finally fit one last piece into this picture which I've been constructing by turning to the subject of archetypes to see whether cognitive science can also help us to define and describe them better. I did not discuss archetypes in any depth when talking about fantasy, and many Jungians would say that they do not use Klein's model of fantasy at all, and that, like Jung, they do not regard instinctual drives as the source of fantasy. Instead, Jungians consider archetypes to be the source of fantasy and of the distortions of external reality and of our memories which fantasy creates. Now, there has been considerable debate recently in recent issues of the Journal of Analytical Psychology on the nature of archetypes, and some Jungians would like to discard the biological basis of archetypes altogether. There was an article by somebody called Pieter Kanen, which some of you may have read. Basically, he said that, there's no evidence that there's any biological basis for archetypes. We simply have to regard them as collective cultural forms. I think the problem with this view is that they cease to have any explanatory value in relation to individual human psychology and become interesting anthropological abstractions which cannot have any claim to be part of the universal human psyche. We are biological animals, and we think, fantasize, and produce mental imagery with our brains. Any theory of universal human mental processes has to be compatible with the working of the human brain. If archetypes are part of the universal human psyche, They must be genetically inherited, and their imagery must arise out of neurological processes in the brain. And I just regard that as a fundamental. The problem this creates for us as Jungians is, I think, the same as the problem that instinctual drive theory creates for Freudians and Kleinians. It seems as though archetypes are often thought of as preformed packets of imagery and fantasy waiting to pop out fully formed given the right environmental trigger. And as I've already indicated, the growing body of research from cognitive science is that the human brain just doesn't work in this way, and that young infants are simply not capable of the complexity of imagery and thought which both instinctual drive theory and some forms of archetypal theory seem to require. Now, time is short. I've got about 4 minutes, haven't I? I think I can do it. I think I've probably given you a lot to think about. So let me just say that cognitive science does offer us a way of thinking about archetypes, which to my mind is actually closer to Jung's predominant view. Jung contradicted himself, like Freud, like Klein. There is increasing scientific evidence that innate structures of the mind certainly do exist, but that they do not contain any content, any mental content. There are no collective thoughts or images waiting to emerge like butterflies from a chrysalis. Instead, research suggests that the innate structures in the brain are simple orientating mechanisms which focus the infant's attention onto relevant cues in the environment, such as the human face. The environment then supplies the information which is internalized and becomes a capacity to recognize human faces and to distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar faces. Now, as I said, although like Freud, Jung contradicted himself at times, there is a lot of evidence that this was a consistent way in which he viewed archetypes, and I think it is the model that as Jungians we should return to. In summary, therefore, scientific evidence suggests to us that the human mind works in the following way. Innate mechanisms, or archetypes, focus the infant's attention onto features in the environment which are crucial to the infant's survival. These innate mechanisms are biologically based and have arisen by the process of natural selection because they improve the chances of survival. If infants look at human faces, they will look at the parent's face and they will begin to interact with the parent, and that is part of the bonding process. It facilitates the bonding process, and that, naturally, it enhances the infant's chance of survival. The environment provides information which is then taken in and stored in different forms in memory, some as conscious memories of specific events, and some as unconscious patterns in implicit memory. In particular, patterns of self and of other people and of the relationship between them are stored in implicit memory in the form of internal working models, which we can consider to be both a form of memory and a form of fantasy, because the wishes, fears, dreams which we bring to an experience become incorporated into the memory of that experience. These internal working models offer us a new way of understanding object relationships, and they pattern our expectation and perception of the present. They therefore form the basis of transference in therapy. Although conscious memories of specific past events may sometimes be very useful illustrations which help the therapist to get a more vivid picture, it is not the recovery of repressed memories which brings about change in therapy, but the gradual modification of the unconscious working models through the long-term working through of them as they are enacted in the transference. It is this that brings about change in therapy.